I didn't grow up in this building. I grew up hearing about it, how it paid for school fees, how it carried my grandfather through years when work thinned out. By the time it became mine, it existed to me as a folder of documents and a predictable monthly transfer. Ownership felt abstract, almost ceremonial. The first time I walked the halls alone, that abstraction faltered. The building was quiet in a way that suggested routine rather than neglect. Someone had replaced light bulbs recently. The stair railings were polished. The mailboxes were dented but labeled neatly. It didn't feel like a place that needed saving. On paper, though, there was a problem. One unit, second floor, rear, had no rent recorded since the early 1990s. 30 years. No eviction attempts. No legal notes, just a blank stretch in the ledger, like a river that disappeared underground. I assumed oversight, or sentimentality. My grandfather had been capable of both. I knocked on the door on a Tuesday afternoon, eviction notice folded in my coat pocket. The woman who opened it was smaller than I expected, upright in a way that felt deliberate. Her apartment smelled faintly of soap and old paper. Everything inside was clean, not curated, just maintained. She didn't ask who I was. "I know," she said, before I could introduce myself. I explained the situation anyway. Inheritance, records, rent. I kept my voice neutral, professional. I told myself that clarity was kindness. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded once. "Check your grandfather's old ledgers," she said. "The handwritten ones, not the summaries." There was no urgency in her voice, no pleading, just instruction. I told her I would review everything and be in touch. She closed the door gently, as if we'd discussed a plumbing issue, not her housing. That night, I stayed late in my grandfather's old office. The ledgers were heavier than I expected, their covers warped slightly, pages soft at the corners. His handwriting was careful, compact. I recognized it from birthday cards. At first, nothing stood out. Rent entries, repairs, notes about weather damage, tax changes. Then, around the year her rent stopped appearing, I noticed something else. Credits. Small ones, marked not as income, but as offsets. Care, Jan, hospital transport, emergency, night, boiler. They weren't regular, they weren't formal, but they were consistent. I kept reading. There were months where multiple tenants had late payments crossed out and rewritten as settled. Notes in the margins explained why. Illness, layoffs, a fire in one unit that displaced 2 families. And next to many of those notes was her initial. Not a signature, just 2 letters, always the same. I felt a tightness behind my eyes, not emotion exactly, more like pressure from understanding something too late. My grandfather had been sick longer than we admitted. The last decade of his life was a slow narrowing. He didn't like hospitals. He hated depending on family. The ledgers told a different story than the one we'd been told at funerals. She had been there. Not as charity, as exchange. I found a final note, written shakier than the rest. Her rent accounted for. That was it. No explanation, as if explanation would have been vulgar. The next week, the city scheduled a routine inheritance audit. I hadn't requested it. It was automatic. Change of ownership, review of compliance. The auditor was polite, thorough, unmistakably official. When she asked about the irregular unit, I handed over the ledgers. She read in silence. After a while, she looked up. "You're aware," she said carefully, "that long-term services in lieu arrangements can be recognized as binding tenancy agreements under municipal code." I wasn't. She pointed to the entries, the consistency, the duration, the fact that my grandfather had never attempted collection or eviction. This isn't unpaid rent. This is settled obligation. The word settled landed with weight. Not forgiven, not ignored. Settled. The auditor issued a corrective order, formalized the tenancy, update records, acknowledge arrears as satisfied through documented services. The eviction notice, she said, should be withdrawn immediately. There was no drama in the moment, no reprimand, just procedure. When I returned to the building, I didn't knock this time. I rang the bell. She opened the door the same way, steady, unsurprised. "It's resolved," I said, formally. She nodded. "Good." I started to say something else. Thanks, maybe. An apology, something to acknowledge the imbalance of the past weeks. Nothing came out right. She didn't wait. As I walked back down the stairs, I noticed things I hadn't before. A handrail repaired with care, not speed. A garden patch by the entrance that someone had been tending without permission or praise. Maintenance as presence, not obligation. Ownership didn't leave my hands that day. The building is still mine, legally and financially, but something else did, an assumption that inheritance meant authority without residue. Power, I learned, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly in a ledger, waiting for someone to bother reading.